All right. So when did you know you wanted to work with vulnerable children and families? I know you already just shared, hey,
Yeah.
at one point we were kind of licensed through Christian
Yeah.
Heritage, but just talk a little bit about that. And I would say for beyond just wanting to work with them, I think again, one of the things I've loved, and we've talked to this on lots of different, podcasts, your heart, your articulation for Jesus' heart, as
Yeah.
you shared, is one of the most trauma responsive people to have ever lived.
Yeah.
And so I think this is those thoughts, sentiments are birthed out of your own personal
Yep.
convictions about
Yeah.
vulnerable children and families. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Happy to. I'll go back to when I got back from South Africa. So I lived in South Africa for a year as
Okay.
a missionary with Cru, short-term missionary. My wife and I were engaged at the time. And so she's actually living with my parents, which is a whole conversation in
That's
and of
another
itself,
podcast.
right? And I will take, and I don't know if she'll listen to this, but if she does, like, thank you, Carly, for still marrying me, right? Like, you live with your in-laws, that could be traumatizing. It
It could
can,
be.
like, you
Could
see
be.
so much of
Right.
like what goes on. So my parents were great. They're so gracious to, let her live there for free while we were apart. So
Right.
she's in Omaha. I'm in South Africa, and I'm doing probably 60% campus work at the University of Johannesburg, and probably 40% kind of a day place, um, working with kids who are either orphans or functional orphans. And I should say, even before that, I worked for City Impact for a little while. I was a coordinator for an after-school program. Wasn't directly doing stuff with kids, but kind of managed the program,
Right.
the reading program in the early stages of, what they do now.
Right.
But in South Africa, I mean, you're with kids who they come here to get a meal, and that might be the only meal they're going to get all day.
Right.
And I am really experiencing this for the first time. I mean, grew up middle to upper middle class kid, always had everything I needed. A lot of the things I wanted, and never had experienced abuse or neglect at the hands of my parents or any family member. Like, nothing like that. No aunts, uncles, grandparents, like, had wonderful upbringing. Didn't really understand foster care or what it was like to be an orphan at all. I had no clue. And so being in South Africa really opened my eyes to that. When I got back from South Africa, my wife and I were going to get married in 8 weeks. So we had a pretty quick turnaround from me returning. And so I was like, I need a job. And we had talked and was like, we think I'm going to be a pastor. Like, that's probably God's call on our life. And so I had applied to seminaries and whatnot before I went to Africa. But coming back, we were like, we just can't afford to do that. We're not ready to move. We're going to be getting married. So I was looking for jobs, and I found a job at what is essentially like a subcontractor with the state. And so I did some family support. I tracked kids who wore electronic monitors on their ankles.
Oh, sure. Right.
I did some transportation for kids to go visit their parents who were in foster care. Actually did a transportation for a kinship kid, and we'd go down to Nebraska City to see his dad every week. I basically hang out with him and his dad every week in Nebraska City. And so, but I had, at the same time I had that job, I'd actually applied probably about the same time I actually applied for that job. I had applied for a job to work with the Child Protection Services with DHHS.
Right.
And they didn't call me back for quite a while. It was several months, but when they did, they were like, are you still interested in this job? And to be honest, I was like, man, you know what? I'm driving my own car. I'm using my own cell phone. I would love to, work for the state.
Right.
So then I started working I got the job. I started working as an investigator. So I was a child abuse and neglect investigator with CPS. My wife and I were at Brookside Church in Omaha at the same time. And if you guys know Brookside, if you're listening, like, man, they do so much with foster care. And so then we were a part of Teen Reach Adventure Camp. We did some camps together. And that was really what started to grow my heart for vulnerable children. Now, I will say, My wife is the bleeding heart. She's the triage nurse who can she's like, let's take all the kids.
Right.
And it's
Yep.
slower for me. I'm more, I tend more toward the intellectual side of things where I struggle. This, if you know me, this is not a shock, but it's great for people who are listening. Like,
Right.
what's James like in real life? I don't, tend to get super emotional, unless I'm cheering on the Huskers and there's a touchdown, right? Like that kind of emotion. I tend not to cry quickly. And, I need the theological jumpstart to say, yes, it's right that we take these kids,
Right.
or we help this person, or we do this. What I find is God tends to use that and then kickstart my heart. And so for me, it's just the brain goes first and then the feelings follow. And
Right.
I know for other people, it's the opposite, right? Where their feelings
Correct.
go and then they start to understand the theological implications. And so I'm just a little different, and that's not wrong or right. It's just the way I'm built.
Right.
So I just huge kudos to my wife too, because I've learned a ton from her, and I'm kind of like, I will borrow from her faith and feelings a little bit to say, yeah, I can step into this. It's scary. But I'm, again, you go back, you use the word partnership. Like that's what it was for us when we became foster parents, was we're going to do this together. I don't know if I'm ready for this. But I trust that God's going to bring my feelings along. So I start to feel the right things the right way. I don't even remember what the original question was. Oh,
well, I would just say,
yeah.
Can I just tell you though, I think that is just a beautiful nugget of how I love what you just shared is, Carly and I borrow from each other.
Yeah.
Man, I think that's such a powerful thought about how we borrow from our spouses, or, I think about the work we do and how we, with our faith communities and churches and partners, there is this exchange of resources that we have. It's not always just this tangible resource. It is our faith resource. And I just love how you really articulated that, Carly and I are in this together, but we have different approaches to have that. And we have an exchange rate. And by the way, you can't have that exchange rate if you don't trust each other. You don't have a felt safety with each other in a way that allows you to learn and grow and benefit from that. It doesn't always feel that way, I'm sure, but I really love what you shared. That's powerful.
Well, I just think there's this danger that's like, if I don't feel this, then maybe God doesn't want me to do it.
Right.
Where obedience can kind of become a dirty word, where we're like, oh, well, that's legalistic. And it's like, no, legalism thinks that I'm doing it so that God will love me more.
Right.
Obedience, because I know it's right, is actually a good thing, because I trust that God's going to start to work in my heart and help me to feel, okay, now I actually really want to do this. I desire to do it. Before, I did it because I knew it honored the Lord, not because I thought it would make him love me more. Like, I didn't become a foster parent because I think God was going to love me more.
Sure.
I did it because I know that this is the right thing to do. And even if I don't feel it, like, this is the direction God has us going. And so I've just always been that way, where my feelings just take a little longer to catch up. And so I hope that's encouraging to somebody. I mean, there's a lot of people who are like me, and they're just like, I don't feel it, so I guess I'm not going to do it. And it's like, no, well, God he'll meet you there. He'll meet you in that. And
And again, we've talked about this. Like, I think of the hospitality and discipleship conversations that we have, is at the end of the day, we are never going to move outside of our comfort zones if they're just completely emotionally feeling oriented. At the end of the day, Christ calls us to really tough stuff that, at times my human nature is like, no way am I doing that. But the Lord's like, man, I'm not giving you an option in this. And I'm going to make, I'm going to create circumstances in your life until you say yes to the beautifulness of obedience. So no, I think there's a lot of truth and wisdom. I think we shortchange God's power and authority because at the end of the day, it doesn't feel right. It's like, well, it's not going to feel right initially.
And I will say, like, I look up to my wife. I look up to my wife in a lot of ways, but I look up to Carly because of the way that she can emotionally connect with something that I just don't emotionally connect with. And so it's a challenge to me in a good way. It's like, I want to be more like that.
That's great.
I mean, I want, like I've said to people before, like in a situation, like I'm not crying right now, but it doesn't mean that I don't have compassion on you. I wish I could cry. Like there's just something it's just something doesn't click where it's like, oh, could the tears flow? Like it's just not there.
Sure.
Where as for my wife and other people, it's like, that's easier. And I'm like, I'm actually a little jealous of that. If I could use that word, like I'm a little jealous that I don't have that. And that's just been a question and a prayer for my whole life with the Lord is, you know, why don't I have that too? Now here's really funny. This is kind of a rabbit trail, but so my wife is kind of the bleeding heart and what I would call kind of a justice advocate. You know, that's what she's been her whole life. And I'm kind of like the intellectual, you know, public speaker kind of person who was a pastor. Well, now I work for this organization where we get to be an advocate for vulnerable people. And now she's actually in seminary studying to get a master's. So we joke all the time that we kind of flopped, but I just think that's God's grace where,
that's good.
you know, we're both like, I'll be 40 this year and she'll be 38. We're still both trying to figure out what we want to be when we grow up. And I still feel like that 18-year-old kid that's like, God, where do you want me? But it's like, this is where God has us. And he's provided these unique opportunities with her in seminary, working at our church, doing theological work and writing. And then me helping our organization become a voice for the voiceless, where 20 years ago, you would have said, nope, Carly would be the one at CH and James would be the one. And so it's like, this is, you know, God just weaves those things together and we've both embraced it. And, you know, we're still learning, like, how do we become the kind of person God wants us to be, not just as a couple too, but as individuals. It's like, how do we cheer each other on in that? Because we're not finished products yet.
So do you think, let's chase this rabbit trail real quick. And then we'll since I am host, I can bring some closure to this.
Your world. And I'm just living in it today.
That's right. I wonder, cause when we did the interview for me, I talked a lot about that. Like, I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up, and I turned 56 here. I wonder if that's the sentiment of childlike faith. I wonder if for those like, well, what's it look like? Never to lose childlike faith. I wonder if at some level, curious your thought on this. It's just popped in my head. It's like, is this childlike faith when you're like, my life is not my own. I'm going to continue to trust the Lord with the decisions and outcomes of my life and wherever that leads. Right. Cause I love what you just said. Like if you had predicted where I would be 20 years ago or 30 years ago, listen, if you had asked my teachers that I'd be leading as a CEO of an organization, I think people would have just laughed like Roy Baldwin. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Like I almost got kicked out of a Christian college. Right. So there were times when like my shenanigans can get the better of me. And I'm like, oh dude, he's not going to end up leading any organization. Right. But by God's grace, he molds and shapes and, creates that. But I'm just wondering.
Yeah, that's a good thought. I mean, I think there's definitely an aspect to it, especially, I mean, in terms of saying to the Lord, like, whatever you want me to do. I mean, you think about kids, right? And like, as a parent, if you're moving, you decide to move, if they're old enough, you might have a conversation with them, but ultimately it's your decision as a parent and you need to do this for your family. And, in the best way possible, a kid might struggle with that, but ultimately they're going to say, man, you know what, but I'm with my family and I trust my mom and dad and I'm going.
Right.
I'm going, and we hear about the resiliency of kids and, that's different child to child. But I mean, when we moved a couple times, our kids were really little. We didn't really run it by them. We didn't say, hey, what do you think about this? We told them and they trusted us. And, one time the move was going to produce great results for them because they were going to be around grandparents. And so that was awesome. But they're like, we trust, we're going to go. And so I do think there's something to that. And I haven't really thought about it all that much, but yeah, when you're praying and you're like, hey God, like what's next? I mean, ultimately you get to the point where you move from, you're not just my God, but like, yeah, you're my father. Like you are my father and you care about me.
Right.
But man, I mean, we've moved so many times just like you, I think if you were to put two people together, could you find two people that have moved more in their lives than us two? Like, I don't know.
I don't think so.
You get to this point where you're like,
Right.
Lord, I trust you.
Right.
It seems like this is what you're doing.
Right.
And I'm open to that.
Well, and trusting him then with the outcomes of whatever that is.
And I think that's ultimately what childlike faith is about, is like, I am just a child. I'm not just a child, but I'm his child. But I am just a child in that I don't have all the information like my father has.
Right.
And so I'm going to believe that he knows what's best, even if I don't know the outcome.
Right.
I will in 5 years or 15 years, or when I get to see him face to face. But until then, like I'm not just along for the ride, but I'm just along for the ride.
That's great.
In a good way.
Right. So I so enjoy like this. I feel like they're sitting in a booth at Scooters with us, and we're just kind of getting a feel for, I think, about how we just started having conversations. That's one of the things I've always loved, James, is just our conversations about faith and ministry and God, his church, Jesus' role in all of this. And so that's one of the things I've loved. So we're getting close to the end of our time.
What do you, I have one other thing I do want to talk about, but I wanted to ask where you were going to go next.
Well, part of that, I was going to ask you, since you are kind of our communications guy, is, what's one of the things that excites you the most about Christian Heritage right now? But I'd love to hear what you have. And then if you want to add that to your responses, like what excites you most about Christian Heritage right now?
I think, well, they kind of relate because what I wanted to talk about was, I think, not my time as in pastoral ministry, but kind of where that led me, and like when I came out of it, kind of what God did through that. Okay. I think for our whole family, but kind of specifically as it relates to my role at CH. And so it does relate. I think I'll answer the question pretty quickly. What I'm really excited about is that we get to be one of, and I would say just humbly, if not the leading voice for churches in Nebraska to become trauma informed and responsive. And I just put it that way in a nutshell.
Yep.
When I was in seminary, I didn't learn about trauma. I never took a counseling class, but I could almost put money on the fact that it wouldn't have been in that class.
Right.
When I was growing up, I already referenced, I didn't learn about trauma. I learned about trauma without understanding the word when I was a pastor. And I mean, I won't get into this because we only have a few minutes, but like I experienced trauma as a pastor in the church.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So I, now coming out of being a pastor, like I am so much more empathetic to just the struggles and the problems that I see in the church to do the kinds of things that Jesus calls us to do.
Yep.
It's not a secret. We've talked about this on our podcast here. Anybody who's ever read anything I've ever written knows where I'm at, that we as a collective church in this country, Jesus is crazy about us. He loves us. He's not disappointed in us, but that doesn't mean that we're doing things, I think, the way that the scriptures would call us to do them. And so there's a lot of room for improvement. And I quote this all the time to myself, not as much publicly, but I love you too. One of my favorite songs is I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For. And I think that song so encapsulates that feeling that, you go back and look at the lyrics, read the lyrics, and you'll see like where it's at in that song, especially toward the end. There's kind of either the third verse or the bridge there where it talks about like, you carried the cross, you took the shame, you bore my shame. I'm messing up the lyrics, but like it gets to this point, this crescendo where you're like, I found you, but I still haven't found what I'm looking for. And I don't think Bono is saying he doesn't have what he needs in Jesus. But I think that the essence of that song is, I found the one, but I'm still looking for the kingdom. And where is it? It's supposed to be in our midst. I'm getting goosebumps as I share this. And like, that's what it's like. I found that, like, I found Jesus. I'm not giving up on Jesus anytime soon, but I'll be honest with you. When I left being a pastor, I was almost ready to give up on the church, and I didn't know how to verbalize that. And I really never verbalized that publicly. So what I found, and while I'm still looking for what I'm trying to find, I think what we have at Christian Heritage is this opportunity to help Christians and help local churches be that. And one of my mentors in college, like, he would always say, I love this. He'd say, sometimes you have to be willing to be the answer to your own prayer. And I really think that there are a lot of us Christians, I'll just include myself in it, churches where we're praying for God to do something. And it's like, God's like, you are the answer to that. Like, what is, it goes back to the hospitality conversation. Like, what is the answer for the brokenness in the world? It is the church. It is people. It is relationships. It is really not that complicated. It doesn't mean it's easy, but it's not, it's really simple. And so when I came out of the pastorate, you know, it just felt like nothing was the way it should be. And is this really, I remember having a conversation with our worship pastor in New York, and he asked this question. He's like, do we just wait until wait till heaven and then we make some is that when the progress comes? And we're both frustrated.
Right.
And it didn't come from a, you know, critical place. It came from this, man, we want to see the kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Right. Jesus told us to pray that way. So he's not dangling a carrot in front of our face. How do we get it? How do we do that? And I think as I've been a part of CH, and kind of as Carly and I have processed life, and again, we don't have it all figured out, and we're not perfect at it at all, but we need people around us who can help us fulfill that calling.
Right.
And I think it's people who have that missional, empathetic, people first, relationship first mindset that Jesus had. Yeah. And that's really where you get to the point where it's like, okay, now I've found what I'm looking for. And I think that's the exciting thing about Christian Heritage is we're in the process, and we haven't figured it out either. We're not perfect either, but we're in the process of helping churches get there.
Yep.
I know that there's a lot of churches, they want to make that happen. There's a lot of pastors and ministers and ministry directors and small group leaders who are like, oh, we want to get there. How do we get there? Well, I think we can help in some ways in a specific niche.
Yep.
But you have to be willing to be that answer for your own prayer. You can't just say, God, could you help vulnerable children, and then not in some way,
right,
do something to help vulnerable children. Right. So I hope that makes some sense. I feel like I was a little bit random.
No, it's so good, because I think it's in that intersection where you and I found alignment, to be really honest with you, because similar experiences, yet I'm not satisfied with the outcomes. And I think, you know, what is the church's role in that? And so I think God has done, I know, things significantly in my life to, you know, think about the church differently and its role. And now here at Christian Heritage. So I think, you know, one of the things that we've talked about is, first and foremost, we are not a foster care agency. And and part of that, we've talked about this. I don't care who I offend. Yep. First and foremost, we are about advancing his kingdom, period. Yep. Like any organizations that says they're faith-based, you know, obviously we get our assignments, and our assignment has been vulnerable children and families. Like but that is secondary to the kingdom call for all of us.
I would even say, like, the way we've talked about it is like, that is a means, like, foster care, families together, beyond prison, training, like those are means.
Yep.
The end is flourishing, because really that's what Jesus offered. You think about the Sermon on the Mount, like, what is it? It's the good life in God's kingdom. That's what flourishing is. That to flourish is to get a taste of God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. Like, that's the mission. That's where we're going. that's the kind of organization we are, is a kingdom organization, not a foster care organization, not a prevention organization. Like those are another illustration. It's just tools. Like those are just tools to help us. Like I love the way N.T. Wright talks about it. He says we build for the kingdom. Like God's kingdom is coming and ultimately will come, but only Jesus can bring it. We're building for it. And the way that we build it is with these tools called foster care, families together. Could be you clothe the homeless, you feed the homeless, it could be rescuing people from sex trafficking. Like there's all these different kinds of way to build for it. And I think, again, to go back to what you said about alignment, is like, that was that common language that we shared, where it's like, we didn't have to try to figure out, what is Roy really talking about here? What is James really talking about? What do you mean? Like, no, it's pretty clear. Like, this is what we mean. But isn't that what the church is supposed to be? And I don't mean any particular church or denomination or tradition, but it's like the people, the church. That's what we're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And I don't mean do. It's like, that's not what we do, but it's like, it's who we are.
It's who we are. And
at some point in history, organizations started forming in this country, and that's how we do it here. If you were in a different country, it's going to look different. But here, it's like we're a constituted organization that exists, not mainly for anything else other than we want to see God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And it will always look imperfect, which is why we have problems, and why there's internal and external issues and all the rest. It's like, there's always problems, but that's what we exist for, is to in some way usher along the building for God's kingdom.
And he's chosen us as we're option. Like, I could think, man, there's lots of different ways this could have rolled out, but he chose to use very imperfect vessels to do that, which, again, we've talked about before. We become then those walking billboards of his grace, his mercy. And so those that are lost are not going to be afraid of coming towards the light, because we're at some level, hopefully, emulating, don't be afraid of the light. Look, if God can use me, God can use you.
Oh my gosh.
Dude, this has been awesome. Hopefully, again, for our listeners, even for me, I think I've learned a few new things. I love just your vulnerability and authenticity, James. I know I am grateful, but I think as an organization, we are really grateful for the work that you do here, how you are a contributing factor to, not just today, but I think the future of Christian Heritage. So we're so grateful that God has aligned our paths and our journeys, and just now trusting him with the outcomes. So
agree.
All right. So I might need help finishing this out, James. So how do I bring this to closure?
You just thank people for listening.
All right. Hey, thanks.
And we'll see you next time. Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And thanks for asking the questions, being a good host today.
Thank you. I think I did. You have big shoes to fill, but hopefully I've done you justice, James. So but thank you to our listeners. Thank you for your support.